source, a much firmer source of clean power generation. So my company, Energy Impact Partners, I never thought I'd say this 2 years ago, but we just invested in a nuclear fusion company, for example. There's actually a renaissance in fusion companies out there, almost even more so than next generation fission at this point, which is kind of surprising. But you know, I think we all recognize that there is this 80-ish or 20, you know, the last 20-ish% problem that wind and solar are probably a really good solution for, I would say, the lion's share of clean power generation, but they're going to bump into these two problems. One is intermittency, which can partially or potentially even fully be solved with storage. The second problem is just scale of deployment. I mean, when you look at studies of high-level renewable penetration in a deeply decarbonized economy that also has pretty high level of electrification, we're talking about a transformation of the landscape that would potentially be very hard to swallow, frankly, for a lot of people. I mean, we're basically talking about like turning much of the Midwest into a giant wind farm, much of the East Coast into a giant offshore wind farm, and little solar farms sprinkled pretty much everywhere you have an open field across most of the East. So, you know, I'm actually less worried at this point about intermittency of wind and solar, because I think there's a lot of interesting storage technology that can solve that problem. But I'm more worried about just where the hell are we going to put it all? Some of that can be on, you know, rooftops in the form of solar. We should max out that opportunity, but that won't get us anywhere near everywhere all the way we need to go. So anyway, but more specifically, your question on tidal and some of these other like alternative renewable power generation sources, I think they're tough. I think they're tough bets because they tend to also take up significant space, whether it's, you know, along the coastline or on land. So they're not power dense like nuclear, for example. So they don't solve that problem. And it's just really hard for them to compete on cost with something like even offshore wind, which is really starting to become commercially ready. So wave power, tidal power, I'm not, you know, not saying it can't happen, but it's really tough.
Thank you.
Keep them coming.
I have a question.
Okay,
hi.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Tom Twist. I'm from Bates College. And I really liked your slide that had sort of a Venn diagram of solutions. The ideas in the middle, I think you had like biomass, hydrogen, and that sort of thing that would sort of solve all three problems. Do you feel like those are the biggest areas for growth? And could you speak a little bit more about those? Thanks.
Yeah, the things that are cross-sectoral and the most sort of broadly applicable are hypothetically biomass, hydrogen, and there's multiple kind of ways of producing clean hydrogen, and then carbon capture and sequestration. CCS in particular, hypothetically being, you know, applicable to, you know, all significantly large point sources of emissions, which would include power generation and, you know, the biggest chunk of emissions globally, which is industrial heat, non-power generation industrial heat, which is a huge problem. And so when I think about solutions that are relatively ready today, are still expensive, but probably would come down pretty significantly in cost with a scale up, sort of regional or national investments in carbon capture and sequestration infrastructure, meaning basically like the pipelines to move captured carbon from these facilities into a permanent storage repository underground, would be like one highly scalable and highly intersectoral solution. But one of the problems, though, you know, for carbon capture is it faces a little bit of the, you know, the redheaded stepchild of decarbonization problem, where like it's still kind of opposed by, you know, many people who are just kind of anti-fossil fuel no matter what. Even though it, you know, it looks today like it could solve a lot of problems for us. The other, but I think at the end of the day, carbon capture, hydrogen, and then direct electrification are going to be in pretty intense competition as like ways of decarbonizing lots of different end uses.
Great, thank you.
Could I ask a question, Marty?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Lawrence, and then Lance, and then I hope others
Okay.
pipe up. I'm looking at you, Rosanna, and who else am I? Dawn, and nobody escapes. So, but yeah, Lawrence and then Lance. This is great. Excellent discussion. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Hi, and thank you for this, Marty, and thank you, Andy. My question, a couple related questions, really. You part of your presentation in the beginning was we don't have 40 years. We can't right now even a decade, let alone 40 years, to watch the commercialization paths and the technological paths converge and become viable. Our timeline is compressed and has to be compressed. So my question is, but I think they can be, and one way they can be is through the data science and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all the plethora of data and possibilities to process all that data that we didn't have even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. Something that we as a small company are looking into to augment what we already do. And I'm curious how a company like yours views all that. I mean, you mentioned you don't like to invest in pure software. Things like, or I don't know if it's you, but in general, the market isn't really investing in purely software solutions, but I don't want to take up too much time. I don't view that kind of data science as ultimately just a software app. It's the availability of the hardware to share and process and export all its data in real time all the time. Is investment in that capability something that you're interested in, and does that contribute to the path?
Yeah, Lawrence, thanks for the question. Want to clarify one thing up front. We absolutely love investing in pure software solutions. All
right, I'll talk to you afterwards about that.
As does most of the venture capital community. Generally, super high margin, faster growth possibilities. What I do believe is that the energy transition, like there was about a decade where, after the first clean tech venture capital investment bubble burst, I think VCs shied away from anything that wasn't pure software and are now kind of finding their way back into it, realizing that software can solve problems, but at the end of the day, we need to move electrons and molecules around and make them cleanly, and that's not. But more to your point, I am, very encouraged by seeing machine learning techniques adopted to speed the process of research and development and testing. Talked to a company yesterday, and there's 3 or 4 of these now that are trying to use machine learning to, develop and accelerate the testing process for new battery materials, for example. What I tend to worry about from an investor standpoint is when a company comes to me with a pitch and says, you know what, we're going to throw some machine learning algorithms at X. And that's kind of the whole pitch, right? Because frankly, like machine learning, data science it's not commodified, but it is increasingly available everywhere. There are more and more people that are trained, that are highly skilled data scientists. Some of the algorithms are available for free from, even kind of near best in class algorithms. And so at the end of the day, it's a combination of sort of subject matter expertise, having the right testing facilities so you can generate proprietary data to train your algorithms on, that would make like a really compelling company to use ML for solving any problem here.
Interesting. Okay, I'll have a lot of follow-up questions. Could we reach out to you offline and I can ask them? Okay.
Totally.
And I think actually in my little screen, Lance and Lawrence are right next to each other. And Lance, I know you're doing some interesting stuff in networking equipment and so forth. So go ahead.
Yeah, and thanks, Marty, and thanks, Andy, for putting on a great session. Our company is Alnetics, and we're focused on a very particular space, which is the scaling of large load devices in the residential space and the networking of those devices. I'd be interested to know, Andy, how your investors, that is to say the utilities, are viewing this particular space in a world where we are going to have a lot more in the way of wind and solar. The renewable portfolio standards will be very tough to meet if there isn't more load flexibility than there is today. And in practical terms, there's practically none. Demand response, if you will, has a long history, but real load flexibility has not been successful at scale. There's lots of pilot programs, literally hundreds. There's a lot of software platforms, a couple of dozen at last count, but nobody's really been able to pull things together at scale. So I wonder how you see that space, and whether or not there's some concern, or whether or not the utilities themselves have sort of conceded that space to what might be the inevitable players like Google and Amazon, who have a tremendous presence already in people's homes, have the connectivity, have computers in their homes, et cetera, et cetera. Is there perceived to be an alternative, and have you seen anything on the horizon that you find exciting?
Man, Lance, you asked the easy questions, huh? I could go on for hours, but let me think of a few points that I think are important. Number one is, yes, the utilities absolutely realize that they're nowhere near maximizing the potential of demand side management as a resource. Historically, they've been driven largely by these energy efficiency standards, targets, policies, et cetera, largely by giving out incentives and rebates on more efficient appliances or lights and stuff like that. And they do have demand response programs in place, but it's mostly with larger commercial and industrial customers still, not highly automated, et cetera. And they recognize that the changing system will necessitate more demand side flexibility. And I would even add on to what you said and say that it's not just wind and solar generation. In fact, I would say the even bigger problem potentially facing the utilities in the next couple of decades is electrification. Right. If you think about the potential impact on the grid from electrifying all vehicles, and then even more so, as we know in a state like Maine, electrifying heating, even to a significant portion of heating, would require quintupling the electric distribution system without some form of storage or some form of significant flexibility downstream. So, I think the utilities recognize that historically they've been approaching the problem piecemeal. Today, like the sort of the largest new source of demand response is smart thermostats. Smart thermostat programs, demand response type programs, I wouldn't say are like mature, but they're maturing. But they don't actually get you, a truly tremendous amount of load flexibility, the kind you would need to solve these big problems, right? And you can delay cooling by a couple of hours. You can shave a little bit off your peak. And that makes a difference in the near term. But when we're thinking about electrification, I do think at some point you need a resource that is truly flexible over hours on the demand side and flexible in terms of when you can use it. And so that leads me to believe that at the end of the day, some form of flexible on-site storage or generation is sort of the only solution to the problem. I think, maybe with electric vehicles, we can get a lot more flexibility, overnight charging, for example. But I don't know. I'd be curious if you push back on that.
Well, I would generally agree. Having said that, the question is, when will that happen? That's a long-term process. Putting a generator or in person's home or a battery is a big expense, and that's there's an upper tier that first of early adopters that are going to be bringing that kind of capability into the home. But if we talk about scale, that's a tougher issue, and we're going to have to do it in small slices. I think I would suggest that there is flexibility to be had today. And many utilities are trying to get after it, but there's too much friction between the OEMs, There's a very big question about the proprietary nature of this connectivity. Nest was a classic example. All the utilities supported the concept in the early days, and all of a sudden the data got shut off. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
So do you want to depend upon a proprietary piece of software and infrastructure when you want the data? And of course now the OEMs want the data as well. That's a new thing. Before they were selling single purpose devices. Now they're selling devices that have dual purpose. They're also acting as energy resources. That never happened before. So that changes the equation. So the question is, who's in charge? And you know, how do you actually build the network at a scale of millions, not hundreds of thousands, but literally millions of devices?
I would just say, like, our thesis, my firm's thesis on this is that the utilities don't have to be in charge, and they can't expect that they will be, because there's so many. I mean, like, you know, Chris is on the line. Sunrun is out there deploying batteries at homes as we speak. And any individual utility is never going to match them for level of customer responsiveness, developing new products, et cetera. They shouldn't be trying to. What they should be doing is making sure that their customers get the most value out of those assets. And they're like, I think one of the best things they can do is develop programs where the use of storage or backup gensets for grid functionality buys down the cost, so more people can have those things. Because I think more people would want them pretty much for backup purposes if they could have them. I actually think a recent signpost that, you know, I don't usually buy into the hype, but there's the story about the Ford F-150 with a battery that has enough power for the average home for 4 days if it's full, for backup power purposes. So you're basically buying an electric truck and a generator. And the ability to potentially use that battery down the road for grid services as well while it's plugged in, I think actually is a pretty big one. And in terms of like a milestone, a landmark for the industry.
That's
So
probably the fastest way to scale.
Just to put a fine point on Lance and Alanetics offering, it's based around the heat pump water heaters, right? And the ability to time when they come on and come off.
The water heater in general, heat pump water heaters as well, really just because that's the low hanging fruit. But the open source technology and protocol applies to EVs as well as heat pumps, water heaters, pool pumps, any number of things.
Ooh, pool pumps, I like it. Hot tub.
Yeah,
And, I see a couple hands up. Sam, you're kind of leaning in, and then Chris, you got mentioned.
I think Chris was actually first.
Oh, Chris.
Andy, thanks for doing this. And clearly you're personally excited about the F-150, as I am as well. But putting that aside, what sector or technology are you personally, not in your sort of company position or investing position, what are you most excited about? And then secondarily, I'm curious if that also overlaps with where EIP sees the most growth.
It's so hard to disentangle my personal excitement from my professional excitement around this stuff, but I'm on a heating kick right now, actually. Both building heat and industrial heat. I mean, you look at those two sectors collectively, very different in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, it's a question of, like, we're currently burning fuel for heat, which is really hard to displace because you're not gaining a huge amount of efficiency advantage like you are in a vehicle where, you know, an internal combustion engine is what, 20% efficient most of the time. If you're burning natural gas to make industrial heat in particular, like high temperature heat, you're really not going to do much better from an efficiency standpoint. So, and also if you were to use cheap, clean electricity to electrify those end uses, you end up with this enormous peak problem, both at the generation level and at the infrastructure, the T&D level. So I'm really excited about ways of decarbonizing industrial heat and ways of storing heat very cheaply at sort of an industrial level so that you can take electricity, make high temperature heat store it potentially incredibly cheaply, ends up being oftentimes probably the cheapest form of storage in the energy system that you can buy, is just to heat something up and keep it warm. And then using that for industrial purposes. So effectively like electrifying industry and at the same time turning industry into a big battery for the grid, I think is really high potential. And then on the low temp heat side for buildings, I also think, and Lance, you're probably quite familiar with this. I mean, the big problem with heat pumps is that the efficiency drops from this like magical heat pump efficiency 2, 3, 4, coefficient of performance once the temperature gets very low. And so if you can use low temperature heat storage to ride through these cold Maine winter nights, you can probably avoid, having to double the electric distribution system to serve, to fully electrify buildings. So I think heat storage, and it's a very different technology problem, but heat storage at the low temp level and heat storage at the high temp level are really interesting.
Yeah, that's compelling. Sam.
First, I just want to say thanks for sharing what you do and doing what you do, Andy. This has been a very educational conversation, and definitely the whole concept of SPACs, and that I think that could be a presentation in itself, and the sort of difference they're making in the investment world. Just a question for you in terms of, I guess, risk assessment and what EIP does in terms of making sure that when you're investing in a new technology, identifying or confirming that there is, to the extent possible, that there is little to no unintended consequences of a new technology, be it social or environmental. It's curious how you all approach that.
We actually have an ESG process that's part of our investment committee process. So every investment we do goes through an ESG analysis, to make sure that we're not ending up actively harming something significantly. And ideally investing in companies that also have additional benefits beyond, purely economic and energy environmental. But, like just to give one concrete example of that, we mentioned biomass earlier. Biomass, I know is very important to Maine potentially in, the future, our energy future. But there's big questions about biomass, right? If we're going to really scale it up at a national, international level in terms of its impact on the environment, its sustainability as a decarbonization solution. So, we're wary about that sort of thing. Yeah.
That's interesting. Paul, while you're queuing up this question, may I just show this for a second? What the heck? So I've been pretty bleeding edge on my EV adoption, and have had some things that cost me a lot of money, but this one looks fun, so I went for it. And the dealer's already calling me, telling me that they're apparently this is on a faster track than some EV intros are. Anyway, but over to you, Paul.
Well, I actually just following up on the EV thing. If none of you have seen the 3-wheel Terra solar powered vehicle with a 1,000-mile range, it's worth looking up. So
I'm not buying one of those.
Yeah, Andy, I find myself contemplating from time to time the potential for the major game-changing silver bullet, and in my imagination right now, the most realistic thing I can kind of consider in that vein would be fusion, but maybe there are other things that are kind of burgeoning that might be there. And I think a little bit about, how renewable energy right now is kind of decentralizing power generation, and how we're really putting a lot of time and investment into building a new grid that will respond to that. And I wonder what happens when and if fusion can really take off. Does that cause us to have to go back to square one? And is that fear create any hesitation for really kind of driving hard on some of the other solutions? And pulling people back from investing because they're just looking at this and they're saying, there's a silver bullet out there and we don't want to waste our money on all the incremental steps before that silver bullet appears.
I don't think anyone's counting on fusion. We shouldn't be, certainly. I do think, you know, again, sort of my biggest concern for the energy transition is that we've come so far with solar and wind. They've gotten so incredibly cheap, which is amazing, and will continue to get cheaper, particularly, you know, in parts of the country where you have good solar and wind resources. I'm a little afraid that the narrative in the public is that we've kind of solved the problem now. Like we have all the technology we need to solve the problem. And you hear people say that sometimes. And like, I think, okay, hypothetically, that's true. We could probably build a grid with just an enormous amount of wind and solar and a bunch of storage, but I don't realistically think we're going to get there. And I don't realistically think a lot of people will want to, because again, solar and wind's downfall actually, in my opinion, is not their temporal intermittency, it's their low density. You end up taking up so much space, the impact on the landscape is tremendous. If you do this at real scale, I think we're going to build out a lot of solar and wind over the coming decades, and that's great because it's cheap, clean energy. But eventually, ideally, we will have a clean, more power dense source of energy, and fusion is one option there. And the great thing about fusion is it's inherently safe. Like, the whole problem with fusion is you can't get these things to react for a long time. So fusion companies are trying really hard to get temperatures that are hot enough, pressure that is high enough for a long enough time to create net energy positive fusion. And all of those reactions are inherently sort of self-limiting. So you don't have the safety problem that you have with nuclear fission. And then also, while many fusion reactions do produce some amount of lower level radioactive waste, it's much lower level than you get with most fission. So we don't have as much of a waste problem. I believe that we will have multiple companies achieve net energy positive fusion this decade. Whether they can do that cost effectively is the big question. You know, I think by the end of the decade, it's reasonable to assume that cheap solar without any kind of subsidy in the desert, or cheap wind in the plains without any kind of subsidy, will be 1 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour, probably closer to 1. Now you need a lot of transmission, maybe that adds another 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So can we make fusion that is cheaper than 3 cents a kilowatt hour? Maybe. We made one bet that we can. Zap Energy is the name of the company. Yeah, I'm hopeful.
Well, this is great. And Andy, thank you so much. Ed, I'm sorry to leave you hanging with, I know a question, but we should wrap just because everyone is got a busy day, I'm sure. And I hope that you'll register for this event, which will tie in actually pretty nicely to everything that we've been talking about today. So a round of applause for Andy today and his team. A wonderful presentation. Look for us to do a couple of in-person mixers over the summer. In fact, if you have ideas of a venue where we can have a quick little tour and a get together, let me know. And appreciate you being a member of E2Tech. It makes it possible for us to do what we do. And stay tuned for the announcement of the acceptance of Clean Tech Open. That actually will be coming out a week from tomorrow. You should hear what great Maine companies are going to follow Baseline ES and other E2Tech companies. So have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you on June 22nd, if not before. Cheers.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marty.
Andy.
Thanks.
Great
Andrew.
presentation. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
good
all.
to see you, Don. Cheers.